This podcast contains adult themes and graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised.
A commercial-free version of this podcast is available on Patreon for $1 per month. Patreon.com/Beyond Contempt podcast. I'm Renee, and this is Beyond Contempt True Crime. The Dry Bean Saloon, Fitchburg, Wisconsin. My older Madisonian listeners might be familiar with this establishment. It was open for almost 2 decades, but closed for good in 2011. When I was in my early mid-20s and lived in Fitchburg, I would often go to the Dry Bean on Thursday nights with my coworkers to blow off some steam. We probably drank more than we should have, but it was always a great time. Thursday nights were legendary. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill karaoke experience. There was an elevated stage and a large dance floor. If you were going to sing karaoke, you had to have some enormous stones to step on that stage. And there were so many amazing singers that set the bar high. In 2003, I bought a house in Madison city limits and didn't go to the Bean as often after that. The victim in this case was a few years younger than me. She was going through her Dry Bean era about 2 years after mine ended. She was young, single, and living her best life. The victim just met the wrong person on December 5th, 2005. Just one more thing before we get into this case. When I went back through the newspaper archives, I read an op-ed-style piece by Susan Lampert Smith in the April 18th, 2006 edition of the Wisconsin State Journal. The author was bothered by the fact that the victim drank too much alcohol that night and went home with the perpetrator. Basically, the writer's argument was that a beautiful, well-put-together woman, like the victim, would never have looked twice at a loser like the perpetrator if she had been sober, because the perpetrator's only redeeming quality was he cleaned septic systems, in her view. The author wrapped up the article by saying that perhaps we should have a picture of the victim and her tragic story on women's restrooms in taverns all over Madison. You know, when you're in your 20s, you make mistakes, and you don't execute life perfectly. When you're in your 40s, you do the same, but hopefully you do it better than when you're in your 20s. Thousands of people make the same decision as the victim, and they didn't end up murdered. These types of articles, they're not persuasive, they don't change behavior. And if we're going to moralize to a certain group about how to not get murdered, then we might balance that by also moralizing to the other group about how to not murder. That's all. You're listening to episode 79, Angela Drake. Oregon is a small village in Dane County, Wisconsin, and is a 25-minute drive south of Madison. It is small and charming with 11,000 people. Oregon is more affordable than Madison, so many choose to buy a home there and drive into Madison for their job. 25-year-old Angela Drake lived in Oregon, Wisconsin with her father. She was born on November 4th, 1980, at St. Mary's Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin. She was the oldest of 3 children and was a social and outgoing person. Angela loved Christmas and was the first one to wear a Santa hat. She had no problem wearing it all season long. Angela played the piano and was on the tennis team. She attended the Holy Mother of Consolation Church in Oregon. Angela went through all the standard Catholic processes from baptism to confirmation. Religion was important to her, and she taught religious education at her church for 7 years. Angela received her child care teaching certificate because she was drawn to working with kids. She graduated from Oregon High School in 1999. In 2002, she worked for the Monona Grove School District as a special education assistant and cared for children with special needs. Angela attended Madison Area Technical College and received her LPN certification in 2003. She previously worked at Fitch's Chop House in Fitchburg, which has long since been closed, and also worked as an EKG technician at the University Hospital. For her most recent job, Angela was employed at REM Home Healthcare in Madison. Many of her clients were children. One client picked Angela to go on a trip to Orlando, Florida. She was taking care of a child named Marco Manning from Deerfield, who was part of the Make-A-Wish Foundation. Marco suffered from complications from oxygen deprivation at birth. Angela was part of the nursing team, and she spent 2 or 3 days a week taking care of him. Marco's dad said Angela felt like part of the family, which was why she was the nurse chosen to accompany them for their upcoming Disney World trip that was funded by the Make-A-Wish Foundation. Angela was a happy, positive person with no shortage of friends. She met her best friend, Tanya Turchek, in high school. They were drawn to one another because they had similar blunt, tell-it-like-it-is personalities. The pair would go to the Dry Bean Saloon 2 or 3 times a month because it was only a block away from Tanya's apartment. On Thursday, December 8th, 2005, Angela was at the Dry Bean Saloon in Fitchburg, Wisconsin. Thursday nights were a big deal at the Dry Bean, as it was karaoke night. On those nights, the bar was packed and the drinks were flowing. Angela was at the Dry Bean with her friend Tanya. They met up at the bar around 10:15 p.m. Angela took the stage that night and sang her signature song, Piece of My Heart by Janis Joplin. Tanya wanted to go home early, but Angela wanted to stay, as she was talking to a man named Oliver. Tanya felt good about leaving her friend at the bar because Tanya's apartment was only a block away. Angela was going to leave the bar when she was ready and walk over to Tanya's place to stay the night. They did this all the time. Tanya left the Dry Bean around 11:30 p.m. The next morning on Friday, when Tanya woke up, Angela was not there. Tanya thought little of it. Maybe Angela drove back home to Oregon. Saturday evening rolled around, and Tanya was worried. Angela's car was still parked at the Dry Bean. Tanya knew if Angela left her car there that Thursday night, she would have picked it up at 6 a.m. on Friday morning. That evening, Tanya met up with her friend group, and no one had heard from Angela. She returned no calls. This was out of character for Angela, so Tanya called Angela's dad. Angela's dad placed a call to the police and reported her missing at 7:30 on that Saturday evening. On Monday, December 12, 2005, Angela's mother and stepfather started sending out emails, asking people in their networks to help find their daughter. A few people who had been at the Dry Bean on Thursday night received that email. They called the Oregon police and told them that the missing 25-year-old woman had spent the night with their 24-year-old roommate, Michael DeSalvo. He was the last person seen with Angela on that night at the Dry Bean. The man named Oliver, who had also been talking with Angela, was no longer of interest to the police, and they turned their attention to Michael DeSalvo. On Tuesday, December 13th, 2005, DeSalvo didn't show up to court for a felony drug charge. Back in September 2005, they arrested him for having OxyContin in his possession. Investigators had signed search warrants and went through DeSalvo's car and duplex, where he lived on Fitchburg Road. DeSalvo had only lived at that residence for approximately 2 months. Prior to living at the duplex, DeSalvo lived with a girlfriend in Brodhead, Wisconsin. On Wednesday, December 14th, 2005, Michael DeSalvo was arrested around midnight for a probation violation, which was connected to felony theft charges from Minnesota and also the drug charge from Wisconsin. Assistant District Attorney Michael Verveer said DeSalvo's record from Minnesota was several pages long. He was booked into the Dane County Jail, and they set his bail at $50,000. On Friday, December 16, 2005, the Holy Mother of Consolation Church in Oregon, Wisconsin, was packed, and everyone was praying for Angela Drake, who had been missing for a week and a half. They had a candlelight vigil to show support for the Drake family. The church originally purchased 500 candles, but ran out because of the huge turnout. The church staff had to scramble to find more. They estimated 700 people showed up on that cold Wisconsin Friday night in December. Angela's father, Larry Drake, said the support would carry him through the following week. Larry Drake was fully behind the Fitchburg and Oregon police and placed his full faith and trust with them. The first inkling of what may have happened to Angela Drake was reported in the local news. 23-year-old Tom Allen was with DeSalvo and a few other roommates on that night. They met Angela at the Dry Bean. They didn't know Angela well, but she seemed to be really intoxicated. He thought Angela didn't have any of her friends at the bar with her. At 1:30 a.m., the group loaded into 2 cars and went to a nearby bar on McKee Road called Monkey Shines, which is about a 5-minute drive from the Bean. Tom Allen drove in one car, and Angela and DeSalvo were in the other. When Tom arrived at Monkey Shines, Angela and DeSalvo were not there. They had dropped their passengers off at Monkey Shines and went back to DeSalvo's duplex at 3414 Fitchburg Road. When Tom got back to the duplex a little after 2 a.m., DeSalvo was in the living room, sitting on the couch, and his bedroom door was shut. Tom left the living room for a bit, and when he returned, DeSalvo was gone, and the bedroom door was closed. He thought about knocking on the door, but didn't. Tom was worried about how drunk Angela was, but he didn't want to intrude on his roommate's privacy. Ultimately, Tom never saw Angela inside of the duplex and went to bed at 2:40 a.m. Another roommate saw Angela on DeSalvo's bed that night around 2:45 a.m., and he was removing her socks. Tom saw DeSalvo at 9 a.m. the next morning. When DeSalvo was leaving the house, Tom inquired about Angela. DeSalvo said that he had taken her somewhere, and Tom got the impression that she had been dropped off wherever she needed to go. Later on, there was a photo of Angela Drake being distributed around the community, stating that she had gone missing. Tom recognized the picture, but he wasn't immediately concerned. He figured she would turn up. But he also didn't know DeSalvo well. They recently invited him to stay at their duplex because he had nowhere to live. Investigators spent the next 2 weeks searching for Angela. On Thursday morning, December 22, 2005, all hope of finding Angela Drake alive was extinguished. At 11:25, a patch of red in the snow-covered creek bed caught the eye of Detective Wayne Honers. When he crossed the embankment, he saw a woman's body, half covered in snow, in a culvert near a bridge on Storytown Road. Her puffy black winter vest was found nearby. The woman's arms were crossed over her chest. Her hands were clenched and dirty. Oak leaves were stuck to the victim's cheek. The victim's body matched Angela Drake's physical description, but it would have to be officially confirmed. The woman only had on a turtleneck sweater and socks. Wisconsin weather had been exceptionally cold, so they delayed the autopsy until Monday. John Stanley was a Dane County coroner and was on the crime scene that day. He was shaken because he knew the Drake family, so this case was personal for him. The coroner was the first person to turn her body over. In his experience, people who suffered from hypothermia faced downward and typically pulled their arms to their chest and stretched their legs out. He said that her dirty hands were clenched, and they likely got that way in the ditch. She could have only clenched her fists under her body if she were still alive when she was placed there. The Drake family didn't need to wait until the autopsy for confirmation that that woman was their daughter. Angela's grandmother said that God would lead the police to Angela, and once they found her, she would get up and greet them. Grandma said that God answered the first part, and at least they knew where she was. On Christmas evening and Christmas Day, she found peace in singing with her church choir at the Good Shepherd Church in Sun Prairie. On December 26, 2005, an autopsy didn't provide many answers for investigators, but it confirmed that the body was that of 25-year-old Angela Drake. When news outlets obtained the probable cause affidavit penned by the Fitchburg police, they reported the affidavit was given to the Dane County DA and recommended charging DeSalvo with first-degree intentional homicide, felony murder, and concealing a corpse. Michael DeSalvo dumped Angela Drake in a culvert in the rural town of Oregon. He may have asphyxiated her or knowingly left her alive to freeze under a bridge on Storytown Road, which was 3 miles from DeSalvo's duplex in Fitchburg, and was on the way to Angela's father's house, where she lived. When investigators initially questioned DeSalvo, he said Angela woke him up at 5 a.m. and said she had to go to work, so he drove her home that morning. But when asked, he couldn't tell law enforcement where her house was located. DeSalvo told one roommate he had sex with Angela, and then told another roommate that he didn't. DeSalvo told investigators he didn't remember if he had sex with Angela or not. When police arrested DeSalvo, they found clothing in a trash bag in the back of his GMC Jimmy. It was Angela's boots, jeans, and underwear. When investigators searched his duplex, they took pillows, a mattress, a hair clip, and a washcloth. DNA testing showed that one piece of clothing from the SUV had been worn by Angela Drake. They found male DNA on her underwear. On DeSalvo's bed, there were bloodstains that also matched Angela's DNA. Dr. Robert Huntington, the forensic pathologist, said that they were waiting on a few tests to be completed, but the aspirations found in her lungs were consistent with asphyxiation. The state crime lab was massively backlogged, so the test results weren't being returned quickly. The pathologist wasn't able to determine if Angela had been left dead or alive in the culvert. Even if she was left alive, any reasonable person would understand that leaving an intoxicated person on the ground in Wisconsin in those brutal winter conditions would lead to their death. Airborne allergens are the most common allergy triggers, such as pollen, pet dander, dust mites, and mold. So what's the solution? Air Doctor. Air Doctor filters out contaminants and allergens so your lungs don't have to. Air Doctor uses an ultra HEPA filter that's been independently tested to remove 99.99% of tested bacteria and viruses. Allergens can vary in size, but the average pollen size is about 25 microns. Air Doctor virtually removes 100% of particles as small as 0.003 microns in size. Their classic Air Doctor 3000 purifier is powerful enough to circulate the air in a 630-plus square foot room 4 times an hour. Air Doctor comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you don't love it, just send it back for a refund, minus shipping. So head to airdoctorpro.com and use promo code BEYOND. And depending on the model, you'll receive up to 39% off or up to $300 off. Lock this special offer by going to airdoctorpro.com and use promo code BEYOND. On March 24, 2006, Michael DeSalvo pleaded no contest to possessing OxyContin. DA Brian Blanchard still did not charge DeSalvo with murder and was reviewing the autopsy report from the forensic pathologist. In April 2006, Fitchburg police filed a search warrant for 6 carpet samples they wanted tested from DeSalvo's GMC Jimmy. They were collecting more evidence to bolster their murder case. On April 14, 2006, they finally charged Michael DeSalvo with the murder of Angela Drake. The prosecution said that he had sex with her and dumped her partially nude body in the culvert before 8 a.m. on that Friday morning. Angela was still alive and died of exposure and hypothermia as temperatures were below 15 degrees Fahrenheit. There was melted snow around her body. Leaves were stuck to her skin, and she had dirt in the palms of her hands, which was evidence that she was alive when she was placed in the culvert, per the forensic pathologist. He thought hypothermia was the primary cause of death, based on the evidence, but he couldn't rule out strangling or smothering. Angela's blood alcohol levels ranged between 0.18 and 0.20%, per the state's crime lab report. Investigators found her charred ID card in a garbage can on DeSalvo's porch. He also had evidence on his shoe that he had been near a fire. There was surveillance footage showing Angela and DeSalvo leaving the Dry Bean together. DeSalvo had been in the state of Wisconsin illegally. He was wanted in Minnesota on a felony warrant for violating probation, and they had convicted him for theft. DeSalvo used a stolen identity to get his ID card in Wisconsin. The court commissioner set his bail at $250,000, even though DeSalvo was serving time in jail for his drug conviction. His trial was tentatively scheduled for December 4, 2006, but was delayed until March 2007 to give DeSalvo's attorney time to prepare. The defense team's co-counsel on the case could not continue with the trial because of health problems. Plus, the defense was having a difficult time scheduling medical experts that could counter the prosecution's narrative about the timing and cause of Angela's death. Dr. Douglas Kelly was the defense team's expert and could not attend the original December trial due to scheduling conflicts. The district attorney opposed the delay because it was part of the Drake family's wishes. The judge sided with the defense and granted the delay. He also planned to sequester the jury during the trial because of all the press this case received. They rarely sequestered juries in Dane County, which showed the impact that this case had on the local media and community. On December 7, 2006, Angela's mother, Annie Olson, heard that an agreement had been reached, but she didn't know all the details. She was waiting, much like the waiting that her family had to do approximately a year prior when Angela first went missing. Her husband, Tim Olson, who was Angela's stepfather, said that they were concentrated on memories of Angela the last year. They focused on sharing those memories with family and friends as a way of coping with the loss. They had thought little about DeSalvo and did not let their emotions make him a priority. Tim said, "Our priority is Angie, how she's touched people. We're putting him off to the side." Angela's father, Larry Drake, tried to pull a page out of his daughter's playbook. She said that the happiest of people don't necessarily have the best of everything. They just make the most of everything that comes along their way. Larry thought that this was the only way to get through this tragic situation. The community tried to support the Drake family through this difficult time and dedicated a room in the Oregon Community Sports Arena to Angela. It was a room where they planned to have meetings, seminars, workshops, and events, and it would carry her name. Michael DeSalvo once told his roommate he left his big city Minneapolis life behind and came to Wisconsin to make a fresh start. But his life only became more troubled, and that trouble reached a new level after that night at the Dry Bean. Many Madisonians knew DeSalvo after he arrived in Wisconsin, but elected to not give the press any interviews or admit that they knew him at all. Former employers did not want their businesses associated with him. DeSalvo's previous girlfriends had a hard time coping with the fact that they dated a man who was charged with murder. DeSalvo arrived in Madison, Wisconsin in 2004, intending to enroll in Madison Area Technical College, but that never happened. He worked as a small engine mechanic for a Madison company that sold sprayers for painting and drywall. 2 weeks prior to Angela's murder, DeSalvo was cleaning septic systems for a living. He was renting a room from Shane Skate at the time of his arrest. He met DeSalvo at the end of summer in 2005 at a go-kart league in Middleton, Wisconsin. Shane described DeSalvo as being a little troubled, but not a bad person. Shane and another one of his roommates looked up DeSalvo on the Wisconsin court record system. In Wisconsin, we call this C-capping, as in, did you C-cap that new hire? Because he seems pretty shady. It's a public records website where you can easily look up criminal records for free. When Shane looked up DeSalvo's, he found nothing, so he wasn't too worried about DeSalvo causing problems. Shane thought DeSalvo moved to Wisconsin because he came from a rough area in Minneapolis, where one neighbor pulled a shotgun on another neighbor. It sounded like DeSalvo was trying to make a fresh start and wanted to escape all the crime back home. But this was DeSalvo's spin on the truth, and he left out much of the reality. Court records from Hennepin County in Minnesota showed DeSalvo was wanted by the police. He stopped checking in with his probation officer in summer 2004, which was part of his auto theft conviction. Michael DeSalvo grew up in his mother and stepfather's house in Hopkins, Minnesota, which is an affluent suburb of Minneapolis. His parents were financially well off, but they were extremely fiscally conservative and spent little money. DeSalvo would get teased by other kids at school who drove nice cars and were given every material possession that a kid could desire. DeSalvo graduated from Hopkins High School in Minnetonka, Minnesota. He had been an avid chess player and had played many instruments. But he ran with a group of bad kids, which led him to being convicted of various crimes from 2002 to 2003, including cashing a stolen check, breaking into and stealing cash from a shop where he worked, and stealing a car from a dealership. Court records from Minnesota showed that he was also ordered to continue with psychiatric treatment and was prescribed lithium and Prozac for a bipolar disorder and depression. In Minnesota, he had a probation and theft warrant that never caught up with him in Wisconsin, even though he had been caught speeding in February 2005. The police officer found a small amount of marijuana in his car and charged him with misdemeanor drug possession. He pleaded no contest to lying to the police about his identity, which he tried to conceal, but was just charged a fine. The drug possession charge was dismissed. In 2005, they pulled him over at a traffic stop in McFarland, Wisconsin. The officer found DeSalvo had OxyContin, and they charged him with felony drug possession this time. DeSalvo was never brought back to Minnesota because when the judge signed the warrant, he stated it was not to be executed outside of the borders of Minnesota. For lesser crimes, often, states do not seek extradition outside their borders because of the extra expense involved. On Friday, December 8, 2006, 25-year-old Michael DeSalvo pleaded no contest to the lesser charge of first-degree reckless homicide. The original charge was going to be first-degree intentional homicide. With first-degree reckless homicide, this was an admission that his actions and decisions created a risk of death or great bodily harm, and that he had been aware of that risk. The assistant DA recommended DeSalvo receive no more than 15 years in prison. Some members of the Drake family wept and held each other. Angela's mother felt this was a good first step for DeSalvo in accepting responsibility for what he had done. Angela's father also thought it was a step in the right direction. However, while DeSalvo accepted some responsibility, Larry Drake wanted him to accept the full responsibility. He hoped DeSalvo would get 20 years in prison before he was paroled. Ultimately, the plea agreement allowed the Drake family to avoid the pain of having to attend a criminal trial. Michael DeSalvo's sentencing hearing was held on May 2, 2007. According to DeSalvo, when he woke up on the morning of December 9, 2005, Angela Drake was in his bed and wasn't breathing, so he panicked. After smoking to calm his nerves, he decided that the best course of action was to hide her body. So he drove to the drainage ditch on Storytown Road and dumped her there. But this story did not align with the autopsy and the analysis given by the coroner or the forensic pathologist. It did not sit well with Angela's mother and stepfather, who felt like they couldn't trust anything he said because of his history of lying. The explanation did not sit well with the judge, who said, "You decided at this point that she was, in fact, dead, and that there was no other explanation. The problem with that is that it was not your choice to decide. It seems to me that any normal person, their reaction would have been to dial 911. DeSalvo offered a brief apology to the Drake family. "All I can say is, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't hold much water. I really am sorry. I'm a good person when I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, taking my medications, and not running from my responsibilities." Drake family members and Angela's best friend, Tanya, told the judge what the loss of Angela meant to them and what kind of sentence they believed DeSalvo deserved. The judge received 70 letters telling him that the prosecution's suggestion of a 15-year sentence was too light. No one from Michael DeSalvo's family attended his trial. His sister was the only person to write to the judge and say anything positive on his behalf. Her letter referred to DeSalvo as a beautiful man who had a heart of gold, but his compassion was mixed with a mind of questions and false realities. His 4 sisters loved him. His family always attempted to understand him and tried to decipher his realities, which was perhaps a not-so-disguised admission that he told a lot of lies and lived in his own reality. DeSalvo's sister hoped he would not die in prison while serving a sentence that he was responsible for. After learning more about DeSalvo, Larry Drake felt he was a narcissistic sociopath, and a 15-year sentence simply wasn't enough. Angela's sister was upset when she learned DeSalvo described the way he carried Angela to the drainage ditch as like how someone might describe carrying their bride on their wedding night. Angela's mom always taught her kids to never use the word hate in relation to people, but she said, "I wonder how Angie felt when Michael DeSalvo put her into his vehicle with only her turtleneck and socks on, drove her around, and finally put her in her place of death. She died alone that cold night. I hope she hated Michael DeSalvo." The judge ignored the prosecution's recommendation of 15 years and sentenced 26-year-old Michael DeSalvo to 25 years in prison with 10 years of extended supervision. The Dane County Circuit Judge said Michael DeSalvo could serve the extended supervision in his home state of Minnesota if he promised to never return to Wisconsin. On May 4, 2007, they sentenced DeSalvo to a year in jail for his OxyContin drug conviction. He already spent 1 year sitting in jail waiting for his homicide trial to begin, so the judge considered this time already served. In December 2007, DeSalvo's appeals attorney withdrew from his case, and DeSalvo wanted to represent himself. The judge asked DeSalvo a series of questions to ensure he was competent and understood what he was undertaking. The judge warned him and said lawyers can spot avenues of appeal that defendants might not realize. DeSalvo's response was that lawyers can miss stuff too. Michael DeSalvo is currently housed in the Stanley Correctional Institution in Stanley, Wisconsin, approximately 45 minutes east of the Twin Cities. He could be released by 2031. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Beyond Contempt. Please visit BeyondContemptPodcast.com for the links to the sources and music used in this episode. Research, writing, editing, audio production, and sound design were performed by me, Renee. If you like the show, please leave me a positive review in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Thank you so much, everyone.